The sweater was wrong. That's what I kept thinking as I stood in the entryway of the Thornton Community Center, holding a bottle of Cabernet I'd brought as a hostess gift and immediately regretting everything about that decision. The sweater was too formal for a backyard birthday party, too casual for the kind of evening this was turning out to be, and the Cabernet was probably the wrong call too, because Gwen had moved on to mocktails after her second pregnancy, and I hadn't thought to ask. Small things. Tiny miscalculations. That's what was going through my head when I heard his voice. Ivy. Not a question, not a greeting. Just my name, said the way you'd say finally, like he'd been waiting for me to walk through that door, just so he could remind me of something. I turned slowly. I've learned to do that over the years. Slow turns. It gives you a second to arrange your face. And there was Kyle Mercer, standing near the drink table with a bottle of Molson in his hand, and that grin. God, that grin, the one that always looked like he knew something you didn't. 15 years. 15 years since university. 15 years since the night he'd sat across from me in the Tim Hortons on Elgin Street and told me, very calmly, very reasonably, that he thought I was holding him back, that I was too focused on school, that I didn't know how to have fun, that I should take it as a compliment, honestly, because he only said hard things to people he respected. I had cried for 3 days. Not because I loved him desperately. I was 22, I thought I did, but I understand now it was mostly shock, but because I genuinely could not figure out what I had done wrong. I replayed every conversation. Every dinner where I'd ordered the wrong thing, laughed too loudly, stayed too quiet. I wrote actual lists. Pros and cons of myself as a girlfriend on lined notebook paper. I didn't tell anyone that part. I've never told anyone that part until right now. The thing is, Gwen Harcastle's 40th birthday party was the absolute last place I expected to see Kyle Mercer. They'd never been close. I didn't even know he was still in Ottawa. Last I'd heard, maybe 7 years ago, through mutual people we'd both since stopped seeing, he was working in commercial real estate and had gotten engaged to someone from his cycling club. But there he was, and there I was. And the sweater was still wrong. Ivy Chen, he said, louder now, walking toward me like we were old friends reuniting at a cottage. Didn't expect to see you here. Gwen and I went to grad school together, I said. You? Chris knows Kyle from the climbing gym, said a woman beside him, appearing suddenly, pretty, composed, holding a sparkling water. She smiled at me with the particular warmth of someone who has been told nothing about you. I'm Britt. We just moved back from Vancouver. Ivy, I said. Nice to meet you. Ivy and I used to date, Kyle said, the way you'd say Ivy and I used to take the same bus route. Casual, slightly fond. Like I was a small, manageable part of his personal history. Ancient history. Britt laughed lightly. I smiled. I moved toward the drink table. That should have been it. 10 seconds of mildly awkward, and then the rest of the evening spent on opposite sides of the room. That was the reasonable outcome. That was what should have happened. But Kyle Mercer had never been particularly interested in what should happen. I need to back up, because the reunion part of this story isn't actually where it starts. It starts earlier. It starts at a kitchen table in Gatineau in November, with my mother reading the newspaper, and my father doing the crossword, and me announcing, at 22 years old, that my boyfriend of 14 months had broken up with me, and I wasn't entirely sure why. My mother put down the paper and said, "What did you do?" Not in a cruel way. In the way of a woman who had learned, through years of experience, that most problems had explanations, and that explanations required accountability from everyone involved. I don't know, I said. He said I was too focused on school. My father looked up from the crossword. That's a terrible reason. He said I didn't know how to have fun. You have plenty of fun, my mother said, which was debatable but kind. I cried some more. I went back to my apartment. I sat on the floor for a while. And then, because I didn't have anything else to do with the feeling, the specific, hollow feeling of being told you are not enough without being told enough for what? I started studying harder. This is the part that matters. I was in my second year of a master's program in urban planning. I had been getting by, solid B pluses, the kind of grades that keep your funding but don't get you noticed. After Kyle, for reasons I couldn't entirely explain at the time, something in me just clicked on. I stopped coasting. I started staying late. I started caring about things I'd previously been going through the motions about. I graduated with distinction. I got a junior position at a firm in Ottawa. I worked for 4 years, went back for a second graduate degree, this time in environmental policy, and eventually ended up at a small consultancy that does sustainable urban development for municipalities across Ontario and Quebec. It's not glamorous. We work out of a converted Victorian on Somerset Street. Our coffee machine is terrible. I love it more than any job I've ever had. None of that happened because of Kyle, to be clear. It happened because of me. But he was the thing that made me stop sleepwalking through my own ambitions. And I've thought about that sometimes. Not often. But sometimes. I had been at Gwen's party for about 40 minutes, talking to her sister about the new LCBO locations opening in the East End, and trying to locate the charcuterie board I'd been promised when Kyle appeared at my elbow. "You look good," he said, which was either a compliment or an opening move. With Kyle, you never fully knew. "Thank you," I said. "What are you doing these days? Still in school?" I paused. The charcuterie was within sight. I redirected my attention. "I'm a consultant," I said. "Urban sustainability. I work mostly with city governments." "Huh!" He tilted his head. "Good for you. Good money in that?" It was such a Kyle question. Not what does that involve or do you enjoy it? Just a quick calculation of market value, delivered with just enough warmth to make it feel like genuine curiosity. "Enough," I said. "I'm in development now," he said, not waiting to be asked. "Commercial, mostly. Some residential. Just closed on a project in Canada. 40-unit condo build. It's been a good year." "Congratulations," I said. "You married?" he asked. It wasn't casual. He was watching my face when he asked it, and something in his posture shifted just slightly, leaned in, just an inch, and I recognized it suddenly as the same thing I'd seen in that Tim Hortons 15 years ago. He was waiting to feel like he was still winning something. "Yes," I said. "Kids?" "A daughter." "Nice," he smiled. "How old?" 4, he nodded. Took a sip of his beer. "I've got 2 boys. 6 and 8. Hockey kids, it's both of them. It's basically our whole life right now." He said this with the exhausted pride of someone who would not trade it for anything and wanted you to know it. Britt coaches the younger one's team. She's incredible. "She seems wonderful," I said, and I meant it. There was a moment where the conversation could have ended, should have ended. But Kyle had another sip of his beer, and then he said, almost gently, "You know, I always thought you'd end up doing something more." "I don't know." "More visible." "You were so ambitious." I looked at him. "I mean that as a compliment," he said, which is always what people say right before they reveal they didn't mean it as a compliment. "You were always so serious about everything. I just thought you'd end up in politics or something. Running for city council." "I influence city council," I said, "which I find more effective." He laughed. It was an easy laugh, the kind that didn't require anything from you. "Still Ivy," he said. I didn't know what that meant. I still don't. The party moved outside at around 8 o'clock. Gwen's backyard was strung with lights, and someone had set up a fire pit. And the 40-odd people who'd come to celebrate her first 4 decades of life spread out across the deck and the lawn in small clusters. It was a beautiful September evening. The kind that Ottawa sometimes produces in early fall, like an apology for the winter it's about to deliver. I found a chair near the fire and got into a very good conversation with a woman named Rosalind, who worked for the National Capital Commission and had opinions about the proposed changes to the Confederation line that I found genuinely fascinating. We were deep into the second phase of her thoughts on infrastructure equity when I heard a small sound behind me. Not a voice, not a shout, just the specific sound of small sneakers on a wooden deck, moving fast. Mom. I turned around. My daughter Elodie was standing 3 feet away from me, wearing the little green rain jacket I'd packed in the car just in case, because September evenings are unpredictable and she runs cold. She had a smear of what appeared to be brownie on her left cheek, and her eyes were bright in the firelight, and she was pulling someone behind her by the hand. Dad said he found parking, she announced to the general vicinity. And then a man ducked through the back gate into the yard, and he was tall, and he was carrying Elodie's little overnight bag on one shoulder and 2 takeaway cups of something hot, tea. I knew, without having to check, and he looked across the yard and found me immediately. Thomas. My husband, still wearing his jacket from the hospital because he'd come straight from a long call and hadn't had a chance to change. He's a cardiologist. He does not make a point of mentioning this unless it's relevant to a conversation. He's also, as Gwen has said on multiple occasions, the kind of person you can tell is genuinely good within the first 3 minutes of meeting him, which she maintains is extremely rare and slightly annoying. He made his way across the lawn. Elodie detached herself from him and climbed directly into my lap. I looked up and saw Kyle. He was standing about 10 feet away, still near the fire, and he had gone. I don't know how else to say this. He had gone very still. He was looking at Thomas the way you look at something you're trying to quickly recalculate. Thomas reached us, handed me one of the teas, bent down and kissed the top of my head. "Sorry, I'm late," he said. "The 417 was a parking lot." "You made it," I said. "Hi," said Elodie, not to Thomas, who she saw every day, but to Rosalind, the infrastructure woman, who she had apparently decided deserved a greeting. "Hi there," said Rosalind, delighted. "I'm Elodie," said my daughter. "That's my dad. He's a heart doctor. He fixes hearts." "That's very important work," said Rosalind. "I know," said Elodie. "He says the heart is just a pump, but Mom says that's a very unromantic way to think about it." Thomas laughed. I could feel Kyle somewhere at the edge of my peripheral vision, still not moving. Thomas offered his hand to Rosalind, introduced himself, asked her what she did. Within 90 seconds, he was engaged in a genuine conversation about the transit file, because that's who he is. He asks people real questions and then listens to the actual answers. Elodie had relocated to the s'mores station, which someone had set up near the fire and which she had identified as the most important part of the party. I looked over at Kyle. He was still standing there. His beer had drifted down to his side. Britt was talking to someone else, animated, laughing. She seemed genuinely lovely, and I hoped she was happy in whatever version of Kyle she'd gotten. He caught my eye. I didn't look away. I also didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. There was no speech I needed to make. There was no moment I needed to claim. He smiled at me. It wasn't the grin from earlier. It was smaller, more private. The kind of smile that means, "Okay, I see." I smiled back, and then Elodie's voice came from the direction of the fire pit. "Mom, your face is doing the thing." I turned. "What thing?" I said. "The thing," she said gravely, holding a half-assembled s'more and staring at me with great seriousness. Like when someone says something and you're being very patient about it. Thomas coughed in a way that was almost but not quite a laugh. "I'm just thinking," I said. "About what?" "About how nice it is to be here." She considered this, apparently decided it was acceptable, returned to the s'more. Rosalind leaned toward me and said, very quietly, "She's extraordinary." I know, I said. Thomas sat down in the empty chair beside me. His knee pressed against mine, the comfortable, unconscious way it always does. He didn't ask who Kyle was. I didn't offer. We'd been together for 9 years, and there are people in my past the same way there are roads you used to take before they built the bypass. You remember them, you understand why you took them, but there's just no reason to drive that way anymore. Later, when Gwen's husband was cutting the cake and everyone had gathered around the long table on the deck, Elodie appeared between Thomas and me and took a hand from each of us. She was sticky from the s'mores, and she'd somehow acquired a smudge of frosting preemptively before the cake had even been sliced, which I chose not to investigate. "Is this a good party?" she asked. "It's a very good party," Thomas said. "Are those people your friends?" she asked, scanning the crowd with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old who has no time for social performance. "Some of them," I said. "Some of them are people I used to know." She absorbed this, filed it away somewhere. Then, in the manner of someone who has arrived at an important conclusion after careful deliberation, "The ones you used to know," she said, "are quieter." Thomas looked at me. I looked at Thomas. Neither of us said anything for a moment, because what is there to say when a 4-year-old accidentally summarizes your entire evening in 9 words? "You're right," I said eventually. "They really are." She nodded, satisfied, and redirected her full attention to the approaching cake. "I've thought about that party a lot since then. Not about Kyle. I've barely thought about Kyle, actually, which is itself a kind of answer to a question I used to ask myself. I've thought about Elodie and what she noticed. I've thought about the thing she called my face. The patient expression. The one she's learned to read the way children learn to read weather. I've thought about the girl who sat on a dorm room floor in November and made lists of her own shortcomings. Who thought, for a long, bewildering stretch of time, that being serious about something was the same as being wrong about it? She would not recognize this evening. The converted Victorian office. The husband who comes straight from the hospital and brings tea without being asked. The 4-year-old who holds your hand and notices things. She would not recognize any of it, but I think she'd be relieved. Some nights, the September ones especially, when the air has that particular clarity and the city is golden before the gray sets in. I think about the Tim Hortons on Elgin Street, the paper lists, the 3 days of crying. And I think about the fact that what looked, at 22, like the end of something, was actually just me, taking a wrong turn, getting briefly lost, and eventually finding a much better road. The heart is just a pump, Thomas says. He's not wrong, but he's also not entirely right, and Elodie knows the difference.